Hey heroes, welcome to another astonishing episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an amount of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelade. The link is in the description below along with other places you can find me. In many ways, the story of Captain Britain truly begins with an individual you've probably heard of before, the legendary wizard Merlin. There are numerous myths and stories that have been told about his life, many of which were propagated by Merlin himself, but his true origins remain shrouded in mystery. This is not helped by the fact that he's had a number of impersonators over the years, like the notorious Maha Yogi, also known as Merlin Demonspawn. Additionally, the true Merlin is not simply an individual being with a mysterious background, but rather an amalgamation of innumerable interdimensional counterparts from across the multiverse, joined together to form a single gestalt entity. And so while many of the tales regarding his history contradict one another, any number of them could indeed be true for one or more of the individual Merlins that make up the whole. The same is true for his daughter, Roma, who, despite her youthful demeanor, is said to be over 4 billion years old. According to one story, Merlin was once the student of Necrom, the sorcerer supreme of their unnamed race. Necrom discovered that at points where two dimensions touched, the exchange of exotic particles generated a certain energy. Furthermore, on the rare occasions in which multiple dimensional interfaces aligned, these energy fields combined, producing an incredible amount of power. Necrom wished to harness this power, but the necessary alignments were too infrequent and ended too quickly. And so, sometime millennia ago, he took two of his students, Merlin and Farron, and traveled to Earth in the Prime Marvel Universe Reality 616, where he constructed a tower atop the site of a dimensional interface. In the decades leading up to the next alignment, Farron meditated, making contact with the cosmic elemental known as the Phoenix Force. When the alignment began, Farron called upon the avatar of the Phoenix and used it to project the essence of Necrom's tower throughout the entire multiverse, causing it to exist on every Earth at the same time and anchor the energy matrix. In truth, however, Necrom's goal was to compress every alternate Earth into a single point and harness the power unleashed by such destruction to attain godhood. He attempted to achieve this by seizing control of Farron, but his Phoenix-powered student resisted. While Farron battled Necrom, Merlin leapt into the energy matrix himself and was swept across the multiverse. And while any account told by Merlin himself is automatically suspect, this one does serve as a potential explanation as to how he and his dimensional counterparts were originally fused together. In any event, the alignment passed, and Necrom, his schemes thwarted, fled into the multiverse. Meanwhile, Merlin eventually mastered the energy matrix and used it to create a citadel in the mystical realm known as Otherworld, and became an omniversal guardian. Now, I will note that in his own telling of this tale, Merlin stated that he established Otherworld itself. However, it's been repeatedly demonstrated that Merlin is an inherently untrustworthy source of information, and other sources presume that Otherworld is where Merlin and his daughter Roma were born, although this too remains unconfirmed. In any event, this realm is indeed important to the story at hand. While its environment is similar to that of Earth, Otherworld is actually a relatively flat planetary body, suspended in extra-dimensional space, and indeed serves as an interdimensional nexus which is connected to every Earth in the Omniverse. Generally speaking, it is most closely associated with the British Isles, as its geography is on some level shaped by the collective subconscious of those who reside there. Otherworld is primarily composed of 2 islands. To the west there was Tirnanog, the home of the Celtic gods known as the Tuatha de Danaan. In the east there was Avalon, which is where Merlin built his Starlight Citadel, a headquarters from which he could observe the entire Omniverse. He prepared a program designed to bring peace and enlightenment to every reality and established the Dimensional Development Court to carry it out over the course of 50,000 years. The DDC was based on the technologically advanced Earth 522 and monitored the various universes, ensuring that one reality's problems did not spill over into others. One member of this group was a fiercely determined and deviously cunning woman from Earth 9 named Opal Luna Saturnyne, who eventually rose through the ranks to become the Omniversal Magistrix, ruler of the court's headquarters, the Hub. With Necrom's return inevitable and other threats on the horizon, Merlyn also founded a multiversal organization of costumed heroes recruited by himself and Roma, and powered by the frictional energy stored by Necrom's interdimensional tower. Thus was born the Corps, colloquially referred to as the Captain Britain Corps, each member of which was stationed in their reality's equivalent of the British Isles, where the cross-dimensional tower was located. I will note that it was this organization which came up with the numerical designation system that is still commonly used to differentiate between different realities. Due to Merlyn's secretive nature, many members of the Corps did not initially know that they were part of a larger force, often learning sometime after being recruited, but in some instances exceptional corpsmen were tapped to join Merlyn's chosen guard. One such guard was a denizen of Otherworld named Sir James Braddock. A brilliant scientist, a mighty warrior, a thoughtful philosopher, and a cunning strategist, many considered Braddock to be the greatest hero among the Corps, including Merlyn himself. And so he was chosen for an important mission to sire an offspring capable of standing up to a multiversal threat that Merlyn foresaw, specifically to combat the reality-warping mutant Mad Jim Jaspers, who was predicted to arise on Earth 616 and grow unstoppable if left unchallenged. Thus, Sir James Braddock traveled to that same Earth, ostensibly replacing an already deceased dimensional counterpart. There he found a woman named Elizabeth, who had been designated a genetically compatible mate. Eventually the two were married and moved into Braddock Manor in Malden, England, where they soon started a family. Their first child was James Braddock Jr., or Jamie, but he was deemed unsuitable for the heroic role that Merlyn required and grew up to become a Formula 1 racer. But about 10 years after Jamie's birth, the Braddocks had two more children, fraternal twins Brian and Elizabeth. Born first and named after her mother, the extroverted Elizabeth often went by the nickname Betsy. Brian, on the other hand, was more quiet and studious but shared a close bond with his twin sister. Meanwhile, their father James worked in the caverns beneath Braddock Manor to create a techno-organic supercomputer at Merlyn's behest. However, at some point the organic base from which this machine was grown became contaminated, slowly driving it insane as it attained sentience. While that was happening, Brian grew into an intelligent young man and began studying physics at Thames University. During a break from his schooling, he returned home to help his parents in Malden, but one night stayed out late wooing a local girl named Valerie Campbell. At the same time, back at Braddock Manor, the sentient supercomputer, which dubbed itself Mastermind, faked a malfunction to lure its creator into a trap. When James and his wife attempted to investigate, Mastermind unleashed an explosion of electricity, killing them both and making it seem as though their deaths were accidental. The blast was so bright that Brian witnessed it from his car outside of the manor, and he was overcome with guilt over not being there for his parents. Now, I will note that one source indicates that James Braddock himself programmed Mastermind to kill him, thereby making his death an elaborate suicide. Another source not so subtly hints that this was another of Merlyn's machinations, which frankly makes a lot of sense and would explain the confusion. In either case, this event caused Brian to wall himself off from others, becoming more lonely and isolated. While he continued his education, he also took a summer job as an assistant at the Darkmoor Nuclear Research Center and buried himself in his work. It was there that he encountered the criminal madman Joshua Strag, aka the Reaver, who attacked the facility with a walking battle tank and a small legion of goons. In the ensuing confusion, most of the scientists were blasted with stun weapons, but Brian Braddock fled to the adjoining car park. He hopped aboard a motorbike and attempted to escape, but was intercepted by an enemy hovercraft. He was run off the road, and while the bike crashed against the rocks below, Brian was thrown clear of the wreck and miraculously survived. Barely able to breathe or move, he dragged himself along the grass towards a circle of power and beheld a vision of Merlin and Roma, the latter of which took on the visage of the Lady of the Northern Skies. They presented Brian with a test, much like they had done before for others across the multiverse, and asked him to choose between the Sword of Might and the Amulet of Right. As he struggled to his feet, he found himself being surrounded by Strag and his men, giving him no time to make sense of the bizarre situation. Deciding that he wasn't a killer, Brian opted to grab the amulet over the sword, thereby passing the test. A moment later, he was struck by magic, clad in technology, and transformed into the Champion of Earth 616, Captain Britain. However, he then faced another test when Strag claimed the Sword of Might and was similarly empowered. Now, it should be noted that while Merlin has reportedly rejected and depowered those who chose the sword in the past, Strag's transformation was apparently facilitated by a group of Merlin's demonic enemies called the Nether Gods. In any event, Brian combated this threat and discovered that his own costume came equipped with an extendable quarterstaff that he later learned could also generate force fields and project fire. Armed with this weapon, Brian Braddock defeated the Reaver and proved himself worthy of the name Captain Britain. In subsequent adventures, he could mystically summon his costume by touching the amulet and picturing the Ring of Stones in his mind. Captain Britain soon made his public debut when he battled a group of criminals in London. He also encountered the villainous Hurricane, whose origin was also facilitated by the aforementioned Nether Gods. But despite his heroism, his activities still earned him the ire of Scotland Yard's Chief Inspector Di Thomas. Thomas, you see, didn't want costumed superheroes in London, as several years earlier on a trip to New York, his wife was killed when a building collapsed during a battle involving Thor and the Hulk. Turning our attention back to the Braddock estate, in the months since his father's death, Jamie had inherited his title, becoming Lord of the Manor. At the same time, the living computer Mastermind continued plotting against the Braddock family. To this end, it transformed James Sr.'s colleague, Christopher Thorne, into the villainous Dr. Sin, granting him the power to cast nightmarish illusions directly into people's minds. Sin was sent to kill Jamie and nearly succeeded by causing him to crash while testing his new car, but Jamie survived and was rescued by his sister Betsy. In the wake of that incident, Betsy Braddock, who by this point had become a charter pilot, retrieved Brian and flew him back home. The two narrowly escaped another encounter with Dr. Sin when he caused their plane to crash as well, and after reaching Braddock Manor, the villain mentally manipulated Betsy into attacking her siblings. Brian ultimately defused the situation, saving all three of them, but in doing so revealed his secret identity to Jamie. Brian continued to battle Dr. Sin, but it turned out that the villain only had power for as long as Mastermind was sending it to him. When the housekeeper at Braddock Manor, Emma Collins, disconnected the computer's power system to mop the floor of the lab, Sin reverted back to his original persona, Christopher Thorne. Weak and dying before he breathed his last, Thorne told Brian that he needed to destroy the computer in his father's lab. Returning to the manor to investigate, Brian came face to face with a holographic avatar of Mastermind, who confessed its role in James Braddock's death. Brian destroyed the hologram's projector, and Mastermind feigned defeat, making it seem as though the threat was over. Brian didn't really have time to investigate further, however, as the aforementioned housekeeper, Emma Collins, had been injured by Mastermind and was in need of medical attention. Meanwhile, having heard rumors of Braddock's supercomputer, the notorious Nazi, the Red Skull, sought to claim Mastermind for himself. In the ensuing conflict, Captain Britain joined forces with Captain America to combat the fascist threat. In the midst of these battles, after stealing components from the computer, the Skull attempted to vanquish both of his enemies enemies by orchestrating an airstrike on Braddock Manor. The estate was seemingly destroyed and would have been if not for more holographic trickery from Mastermind, who projected an illusory decoy while obscuring the true manor. Even Brian was fooled by this, as Mastermind continued maintaining a hologram, making it seem as though the mansion was in ruins. In any event, Captain Britain and Captain America escaped the explosion and succeeded in stopping the Red Skull's schemes to duplicate the computer. They also rescued Brian's siblings from the Red Skull's forces, and Betsy learned of her brother's double identity as well. Amid these battles with the Skull, the International Intelligence Agency SHIELD and their UK-based equivalent Strike also became involved. At the end of the day, Lance Hunter, the director of Strike, tried to recruit Captain Britain into his organization, but Brian refused. He continued to face threats independently, like Lord Hawk, an eco-terrorist with a mechanical bird. During that battle, he was injured in a nasty fall and taken in by Lance Hunter and Strike. While his body fell into unconsciousness, his mind slipped into another dimensional plane. This predicament caught the attention of Roma and Merlin, who upgraded his quarterstaff into the Star Scepter, which allowed him to fly for brief periods. After returning to his body, Captain Britain battled the motorcycling highwayman Ross Horton, not to be confused with the truck-driving menace of the same alias, and other foes including Basil Crushstone, aka the Manipulator, a dictator who ruled over a colony in Africa before he was deposed and fled to England. Rupert Kemp, the Black Baron, a servant of Satan with the powers of both a vampire and a werewolf. And David Ap Reese, aka Dr. Claw, a scientist who was disfigured while testing chemical weapons for the British government under false pretenses. In the midst of these adventures, Brian also grew close with a fellow student named Courtney Ross. During his postgraduate studies, he enrolled in a foreign exchange program and briefly roomed with Peter Parker in New York. As Captain Britain, Brian also encountered the masked hero Spider-Man, and while the two initially clashed due to a misunderstanding, they subsequently teamed up to battle the mad assassin Arcade and escape from his deadly amusement park Murder World. The two worked together on several more occasions, although Spider-Man's humor was often lost on the Captain. Meanwhile, between his privileged upbringing and his attempts at balancing a double life, Brian proved to be a less than ideal roommate, particularly when it came to cleaning up after himself. Compounding matters, he began drinking more, and Peter took notice. The situation came to a head after Spider-Man and Captain Britain encountered a group of canine thieves called the Litter. In the ensuing battle, Brian used more of his strength than was necessary, badly injuring one of the thieves, who ended up hospitalized as a result. He fled the scene and wandered the city for hours, thinking about how he'd never really had to take responsibility for his actions before. Eventually, he returned to the apartment where Peter had already packed his bags. Peter kicked Brian out, echoing his introspective sentiments by declaring that he needed to hold himself accountable for his actions. Brian Braddock took those words to heart and came to accept that he had a responsibility to those around him, one which was all the greater because of the power that he held. Committing himself to this ideal, he completed his education and earned a PhD in physics. But as he made his journey back home, his plane was attacked by the Nether Gods that had empowered Strag and Hurricane. Hoping to lure his enemy away and save the other passengers, Brian grabbed a life vest and leapt from the plane, landing in the frigid ocean waters below. He washed ashore on a Cornwall beach and briefly had a vision of the final resting place of King Arthur Pendragon. He was rendered amnesiac by all of this and lived by the shore as a hermit for months. However, he was eventually found by another of Merlin's agents, Dane Whitman, the Black Knight. The two of them were also joined by another man, Vortigern, who was sent to bring them both back to Camelot in Otherworld. The trio embarked on their quest while the Nether Gods sent a number of enemies to impede them. Eventually, there came a point in their journey in which the three had to separate, and Brian continued towards his destination by boat, guided by woodland elves. He successfully reached a gateway to Otherworld, but before he could enter, he was attacked by another agent of the Nether Gods, the White Rider of Death. The Black Knight arrived on the scene to help, but as he approached, the White Rider fatally stabbed Brian Braddock. Whitman retaliated by striking down their spectral foe, but it seemed as though he was too late to save Captain Britain. Fortunately, all was not lost, as Brian had perished on the threshold to Otherworld, where the realms of life and death overlapped. Through great effort, Merlin was able to retrieve Brian's soul before it was lost forever, and return it to his body, while beginning the arduous process of healing his deadly wound. In the end, Captain Britain was fully restored in mind and body, including his lost memory. While Whitman and Braddock finally reached Camelot in Otherworld, the powerful nether god Necromon rallied his dark forces to lay siege to the kingdom. To combat this threat, Captain Britain and the Black Knight were sent to the location from Brian's vision to awaken King Arthur. They were accompanied in this mission by a stowaway elf by the name of Jackdaw. With his help, they succeeded in retrieving the dormant king and reuniting him with his legendary sword Excalibur. However, Arthur determined that Brian's destiny lay elsewhere and sent him on his next journey. And so while the forces of Camelot did ultimately defeat the nether god Necrom, Captain Britain was not part of that battle. Instead, he and Jackdaw were sent through dimensions by Arthur, while Brian's powers were altered by Merlin, who merged the Star Scepter into a suit, forming a new costume. They landed on Earth 238, otherwise known as the Crooked World, where they encountered the reality-warping mutant Mad Jim Jaspers and his crazy gang. For that story, we'll have to come back another time, so let me know in the comments if you want to hear what happens next. Because that is all we've got time for this week, and thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics get covered on the channel via monthly polls. And of course, if there is anything in particular that you want me to talk about, then be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!